Hey folks, how you doing? Don Grant, CTC, Cutting Tool Counselor, here with another exciting episode of In the Loop TV, sponsored by Harvey Performance Company. Thanks for joining me. If you can, real quick, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, share it, you know, those formalities. A lot of the subscribers or a lot of the people that are watching these really aren't subscribing. It would really help if you do. Please just click that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything. Just click it. It helps me keep these videos coming and educating everybody that's watching them. What are we going to talk about on this episode? Well, I want to talk about end mill and drill coatings, right? Coatings. Is a coating necessarily? Do we need a coating on our cutting tools? Very important to understand what coatings do and how they affect things. But I don't want to rant on the beginning of this. I've read a lot of the comments, and apparently I talk too much. I talk too much about certain things, and I rant. We don't get there. So I'm going to fast forward through this beginning for everybody so you don't have to hear all my ranting or what I'm talking about. You will never break that cutting tool again, I promise you. Now, let's talk about coatings. Next. So we're talking about tool coatings or coatings on end mills. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is how important it is for tool coatings. Like our tool coatings, I mean, think about it. They got a Vickers hardness of 4,000 and a coefficient of friction around 0.2, 0.3 when it gets up, and then the oxidation temperature runs about 1,000 degrees Celsius. What? What does that mean? That really doesn't mean much to somebody that's just buying a coating for their end mill or for their cutting tool. Let's explain what those three things that are commonly known that you're going to see when you're looking at an end mill coating or a drill coating, which is basically the hardness, the oxidation temperature, and then the coefficient of friction. So what do those three things really mean? Let's dive into it and explain it. The first thing we're going to talk about is just those three things. Let's talk about coefficient of friction. Well, there's two kinds of coefficient of friction. There's a static, which is how much force does it take on two surfaces to get an object to move. There's a friction between the object and the surface. In this case, we're talking about a flute, right? But we're not really talking about static because the chip has already been formed. So what we're looking at is kinetic coefficient of friction. And kinetic coefficient of friction means when that object is in motion, what is the friction between that object and what it's sliding on? And in this case, we're talking about coatings. So we want to understand what the coefficient of friction is from the object sliding, in this case a chip, on the flute, on the coating. How slick is that? Because one thing that's very detrimental to cutting tools is when your chips stick to your flutes, stick to your cutting edge. So a coating is very important, and the coefficient of friction is very important to make sure that that friction on the surface is nice and smooth and nice and slick so those chips roll down that cutting edge. That's coefficient of friction. Now, just to give you an understanding of a scale, coefficient of friction is measured from 0 to 1. 0 to 1. 0, for reference, is no friction whatsoever. That object just floats right on it, and there's no force observed or emitted to get that object to move. 1 means that object moving in a side motion on friction is just as hard as the weight of the object that you're picking up. So it's almost static. It doesn't want to move. That's 1. So 0 to 1. So when you're looking at coefficient of friction and you see a 0.2, a 0.3, that is very low coefficient of friction, which means the chip is sliding over that coating, or it's making a better, less friction to actually evacuate and use that. So when you're looking at coefficient of friction, That's what that means. Let's talk about Vickers hardness. A coating has the ability to get super hard. Why do you want a coating that's super hard? Well, materials are abrasive, and if you just go with solid carbide and you don't put a coating, there are certain materials that are going to wear away at the carbide. That's why we put a coating on there, because it has something called a Vickers hardness. The harder that coating is, the less deterioration we get on the cutting edge when we're running in very abrasive materials. This is why Vickers hardness is very important. Now there's a range of Vickers hardness. Now you might see a Vickers hardness that says 36 or 3600, 3800, 4000. For reference, I want to tell you right around 650, 700 Vickers hardness is roughly around 60 Bernal. Or 60 Rockwell, not Bernal, 60 Rockwell. So if you look at just something that's super hard, high-speed steel, that's roughly around 600 to 700 Vickers hardness. Now we're running in the 4000s on coating. We have a T+, roughly around 4400 Vickers hardness. It's very hard. Why is that important to know what the Vickers hardness is? Because if you're running high abrasive materials, let's call high carbon materials, right? Nickel alloys and things like that, you want to make sure your Vickers hardness is up there. It helps sustain the cutting edge and not wear that. That's what Vickers hardness is. So now let's talk about oxidation temperature, which is very important when it comes to coatings. Oxidation temperature basically means is how much heat can that coating sustain before we start introducing oxygen into the elements of the coating that starts degrading the integrity of that coating, right? That's a temperature. And we all know when you put a cutting tool with a coating on a material, you generate temperature at the cutting edge. We need to control that. How do we control it? Well, we used to go with high-speed steel cutting tools. Then we went to carbide. Then we went to lower Vickers, lower oxidation coatings, you know, your tin, your TICN, and now we're getting elevated to the coatings that have really super high oxidation temperatures, so we can slow down the degradation at the cutting edge, because the heat that we're allowing to be there because of that coating is fighting the oxidation. It's pushing it out. So oxidation temperature basically is how much heat you can control at the cutting edge, at the point of contact in your flutes, that allow your coating to protect your carbide. If you think about it, a coating really is just doing that, right? It's protecting the carbide. No different than when you go outside in the wintertime. I'm from Chicago, don't know where you're from. If you're from Florida, God bless you, price of living in paradise, way to go. But I'm from Chicago. If you go outside without a coat on, it doesn't protect the skin. Same thing with a cutting tool. If you don't put a coat or a coating on the cutting tool, it doesn't protect the carbide. So you're only as good as the carbide, the wear resistance of the carbide because of the Vickers hardness, the wear resistance of the carbide based on the oxidation temperature of the carbide straight up. So it's always good to put a coating in your cutting tools. Let me explain how the coating process works. When you put a coating on any tool, there's a thickness, right? And when you have a sharp carbide cutting edge, when you add anything to it, you start making that cutting edge more rounded. Now, when you're looking at coatings, PVD coatings, there's two type of coatings that we're talking about this time. There's PVD, physical vapor deposition is PVD, and then there's CVD, which is chemical vapor deposition. Okay, one is a thicker coating. The CVD is a thicker coating. You see it more on inserts. You see it more with diamond type coatings. We're talking mainly PVD. All of our coatings that we're using is PVD, physical vapor deposition, which is a lighter film that goes over your cutting tools. The lighter film that goes on there, the lighter elements that are put onto that cutting tool maintains a sharper cutting edge. You do not want to make a coating that thick or overcoat a coating to start degrading the sharpness of your cutting edge, especially in carbide and especially in a lot of work hardening materials. So I just wanted to point out the fact that when we do a coating on the cutting edge, it does round the cutting edge. So therefore, would it make more sense to go with a bright or uncoated tool versus a coated tool? Like maybe in aluminum, right? And it does work well. Bright tools do work well in aluminum. And they're a little bit less expensive. But, hear me, the benefits that you get from the coating with the coefficient of friction, right? Carbide has porosity in it. When you put a coating on it, it fills in the porosity, it smooths the surface, and it lets the material slide down the flute. Aluminum, non-ferrous materials, very important to make sure that cutting edge does not weld to the flutes. That's why it's important to put a coating on there. Can you run without a coating? You absolutely can. It will reduce your cost of the material. Might get you in the long run. I'm just saying, production might get you in the long run. But to maintain a sharp edge, extremely sharp edge, is where maybe you might not want a coating. Grade 2 titanium's another one. That's a big one you can kind of look at too as well. So we talked about the main parts of coatings, right? The three things. Hopefully you understand it. Coefficient of friction, the ability of the chip to flow on the coating. That's coefficient of friction. Vickers hardness. Vickers hardness is a different scale. How hard is that coating? You need it very hard for very abrasive materials. Make sure you're mindful of how hard that material is. Oxidation temperature. Oxidation. How hot can I get that coating before I start degrading the quality of the coating, introducing oxides to it, breaking it down? We don't want that. The higher the temperature, the easier or the better it is to run a little bit faster, be a little bit more productive, and also work with materials that cause the most amount of damage to your cutting tool. So, put a coating on your cutting tools. Not all the time, but most of the time. And you'll be happy you did. Wow, what a wrap up on this one. We talked about coatings, a little bit more detailed, but I'm going to tell you this, if you have any questions and you have anything that's specific to your applications, we have a lot of great resources for coatings, internally and externally. Put your comments underneath there. I will answer every single one of them in as much detail as I possibly can. Other than that, thanks for joining me, and don't forget, 3 guarantees in life. What are they? Death, taxes, and spring passes. Have a great rest of your week, folks.